Venezuela is one of the wealthiest countries in the world, and now they're among the poorest, and people are dying of malnutrition and preventable disease every single day. Why? Well, because in 1999, only 26 years ago, they voted for Hugo Chavez, and they switched from a very imperfect market-based economy. Admittedly, there were lots of issues already, I don't deny that, but they switched from an imperfect market-based economy to what was supposed to be a perfect government-planned economy. And now people are starving to death. And that's a particularly personal case for me. I've been to Venezuela. I spent a week in Caracas City, and I've seen with my own eyes the effects of socialism back in 2015, and things have only gotten worse in the 10 years since then. And so this struggle between being free and making our own decisions and solving our own problems versus being centrally controlled and having an all-knowing, all-powerful government make those decisions for us, that is the battle that will decide whether or not technology is going to keep making our lives better, or whether technology is going to become our prison, which is what the likes of the World Economic Forum and others would like to see, where they want the government to be in control of the technology so that it doesn't make your life and my life better, but so that they can actually create a digital prison where we are monitored, we are watched. With digital currencies, they can control what we spend our money on, and in fact, they can control whether we get to spend our money.
Welcome to Discourse with Christian. I'm your host, Christian White, and today's guest is Topher Field. He's an award-winning Australian documentary filmmaker, renowned libertarian political commentator, and human rights advocate. Topher, honored to have you on. How you doing?
Christian, thank you so much for the invitation. I really do appreciate your interest all the way from the other side of the Pacific Ocean. It is always nice to be able to have the opportunity to sort of speak to a wider audience than just the Australians that I normally talk to. So thank you so much for having me on.
Absolutely. Well, I know two great, I guess Aussies, I guess is the term, down in Orange County that I met, and really great people. And but that being said, yeah, I figured we'd kind of start off. I mean, obviously there's always a lot of stuff going on in the world. Figured we'd kind of get your current macro take on things, perhaps geopolitically or culture, or what's going on in Australia, wherever you want to start us.
Sure. I think we're in a moment of tremendous change, and I think that's a really, really good thing. I think change is needed right now, not the hope and change Obama style of change, but actual cultural change. And there's two things that I tend to observe, and these two things are always happening to one degree or another, but when they both rise to a crescendo at the same time as each other, my theory is that that's when you're about to see enormous social and cultural change. And I think the change that we're observing right now, and it has already begun, but the change that we're observing right now is as significant as the sexual revolution of the 1960s. I think we are in another cultural turning point. 60 years on from that, I think we're watching sort of the pendulum reach its zenith on the other side and begin to move the other way. And the two things that I watch for, there are two truisms, and both of them are kind of meaningless on their own. It's when they happen together that it becomes really significant. The first is that the revolution always eats its own children. And the 1960s sexual revolution and the liberation movement that came with that has very much been eating its own children for the last 20 years. If you look at the likes of, I'm going to throw some names at you, I think they'll be well known in the US, I hope they are. People like Germaine Greer, people like J.K. Rowling, people like Martina Navratilova. These were the poster children of the feminist movement, of the sexual revolution. Martina Navratilova, of course, a world tennis champion, was the poster child. She was one of the first openly lesbian sports stars to actually come out in public, and was celebrated for doing so within that sporting world. These people are now persona non grata. They're being rejected by their own revolution because the cultural and the sexual revolution rolled on into transgenderism, and they got off the train. And they said, well, hang on, guys, actually women's rights and feminism and gay rights, that was our stop. We're going to get off there. And they didn't stay on the train as the train moved on. And of course, that essentially means that their own children, the children of the revolution, end up eating their own, and that's what that's what we're observing happen there. But the second truism, and it's only once both of these are happening at the same time that you really know that big change is on. The second truism is that every culture breeds its own counterculture. And if we go back to the 1960s sexual revolution and the cultural revolution that took place there was a reaction. It was a counterculture to the conservatism of the post-World War II years. And that led to tremendous economic prosperity going through the late 1940s and into the 50s, and a tremendous boom that took place at that time. But it was still very much conservative. It was still very much Christian. We have, of course, the stereotypes that came out of that era of the nuclear family and the household as it appeared back then. And the sexual revolution was a rejection of that. It was the counterculture that was bred by the culture. It was bred by that conservative culture created the counterculture. And it's when you see them both happening at the same time, the revolution eating its own children, which is what we're seeing happen right now with the feminist movement and the trans movement, and also a new counterculture being bred and emerging. And this is really interesting to me because this is exactly what we're seeing amongst very young people today, under 16s in particular. They are more conservative. They are doing less drugs. They are drinking less alcohol at an underage age. And with plenty of exceptions, they're actually getting into less trouble. A lot more of them are just planning to go into trades and just put their head down, bum up, do some work, learn a trade, learn how to be useful, and figure out how to make their way in the world. And what I think is happening with them is that they're looking at their own parents, and keeping in mind that we're talking about young people here, they're also looking at their grandparents, and they're saying, I don't want to be you. I'm looking at the fruit in your life of the sexual revolution that you've experienced. And I don't want that. I don't want the divorces and the blended families and the government dependency and the victim mentality. I don't want any of that. There's got to be something better. There's got to be something more. And as they look to find that more, they're realizing they're having to look back a very long way, or they're having to look to people like the Jordan Petersons of this world, the Dennis Pragers of this world, who are kind of fulfilling that grandfatherly role that a lot of these kids don't have, and giving them just simple home truths. Hey, you got to pull your own weight. You need to play your part. You need to take responsibility for yourself. You need to stop playing the victim. And so what we're watching is the emergence of a new counterculture at that very youngest level. And there are others in other generations as well, of course, that have taken responsibility for themselves, etc. I'm not discounting that. But as a social movement, I believe we're observing that taking place right now in the youngest generation. So what's happening right now, in my opinion, is that the revolution is eating its own children and is destroying itself internally. The wheels are falling off the train. And we are watching the emergence of a new counterculture that this time is a counterculture against the dominant woke culture that we've had, and the post-feminist world that we've had for the last 60 years, and especially the wokeness and the madness and the victim mentality of the last 20 years. And I think we're on for a massive social change.
This very much, reminds me of, fourth turning kind of stuff. And I couldn't agree with you more, Topher. I think about even in my own life and such, if this was, I'm early 30s. If this was, 1950, I'd have a family, I'd have kids, got this, that, thankfully I'm a millennial and I have a house. But I see it all around me, and it was interesting that what you pointed out as it relates to kind of the younger, like Gen Z, if you will. I have heard that there is kind of more going back to more of a conservative, if you will, kind of approach, and seeing what millennials and Gen X have gone through, and some of the boomers. As it relates to, well, I guess obviously you gave your current macro take on the culture, then other headwinds. What are some other things that you're observing, or other things that you'd like to share or unpack, perhaps as it ties in with that, Topher?
Sure. I mean, I'm primarily political. I'm not so much a cultural commentator. I mostly look at politics and policy and economics and those sorts of things. So if I can put that hat on for a second, I think what we're facing going forward is going to be, it's an age-old clash, but it's our turn, I guess, to get involved in that clash between freedom, free markets and capitalism, and the ability for people to find their own solutions, versus centralization, government power. We see it expressed as communism and Marxism, but essentially it takes many different forms, but any form of centralized power, centralized decision making, where people no longer solve their own problems, they look to the government to solve their problems for them. Now, that struggle has been going on since forever, the struggle between those who desire to be free versus those who desire to have control over others. But added to that now, we've got rapidly advancing technology. And this is something that's only really been introduced in the last couple of hundred years, since kind of the steam revolution, the industrial revolution, and then the internal combustion engine, followed by electricity around about that same time, followed by the semiconductor and the microprocessor revolution, computing. Now we're moving into AI. Now, this has been a couple of hundred years of really rapid technological advancement, underpinned by energy. It all comes from energy. And I really applaud, in my opinion, I applaud Donald Trump, President Trump, for his uncompromising stance on wanting to turn America into an energy superpower, because that is what underpins everything. Even AI, industrialization, robotics, etc., all of that is just applied energy. If you don't have the energy available, then those technologies are useless to you. So energy underpins it all. And what we've seen is the abundance of energy and the ability to put that energy to work has made our lives better. The improvement in the quality of life of the average human being over the last 200, 250 years is simply phenomenal. It is almost impossible to imagine what the world was like, even in quote unquote wealthy countries 250 years ago. And even poor people in a country like Australia, like America, are tremendously better off than rich people were in many countries in most parts of the world not so long ago. And it's the energy revolution and the technology that has done that. Now, if no one gets in the way, technology will continue to make our lives better. We will continue to become more productive, which means that we can enjoy higher quality of life. Our travel will get faster. Our communication will get better. Our technology will become more incredible. People take for granted things like washing machines and dryers. My dryer just died last night. I'm having to go and see if I can fix it later on today, or maybe buy a new one. I don't know. But we take it for granted that we have these time-saving devices in our homes, and they're so much a part of the fabric of our life now that we don't even notice them. We don't even the thought of not having a washing machine. Most people, I mean, there are people that don't have washing machines and they have to use a laundromat, but for most people, you get a house, you get a washing machine. Of course you do. But you only have to go back about 60 years, 70 years, and people were getting washing machines for the first time. And before that, they were using washboards and scrubbing clothes in sinks. And that was happening up until only about 60, 70 years ago. Can you imagine being a kid and your neighbor gets a washing machine? And it's not that they got a new washing machine to replace the old one. No, no, no. They're the first person in your street to have their own washing machine. And they would invite friends over to have tea and bickies or maybe some wine or something. And they would show off their new washing machine because most of the people in the street had never seen one before. Or maybe they'd seen one in a shop, but that was all. Like, it's crazy to think that this technology, this time-saving device that liberated women from hours of grueling physical labor every single week, is now taken so much for granted. And that is the trajectory of our lives and our futures if we don't get in the way. But that's where that struggle between those who want to have control versus those who want to be free comes in, because the number one impediment to our lives getting better is going to be governments deciding that they know better. And we see this everywhere in the world where they have a centralized economy, where the government knows best. The former USSR was a great example. They were still building Ladas and Trabants and these rubbish cars from the 1960s. They were still building those into the 1980s, whereas elsewhere in the world, of course, technology had moved on. They were more efficient, they were better, they were more comfortable, they'd improved the technology. It's no coincidence that North and South Korea are so different. One of them allows the free market to flourish and allows ideas and technology to make our lives better. The other one says that the government knows best, and we can see the results of that. You look at Venezuela, this is one of the wealthiest countries in the world in the late 1800s, which I know sounds like ancient history, but honestly, 120, 130 years ago is not that long ago. Venezuela was one of the wealthiest countries in the world, and now they're among the poorest, and people are dying of malnutrition and preventable disease every single day. Why? Well, because in 1999, only 26 years ago, they voted for Hugo Chavez, and they switched from a very imperfect market-based economy. Admittedly, there were lots of issues already, I don't deny that, but they switched from an imperfect market-based economy to what was supposed to be a perfect government-planned economy. And now people are starving to death. And that's a particularly personal case for me. I've been to Venezuela. I spent a week in Caracas City, and I've seen with my own eyes the effects of socialism back in 2015, and things have only gotten worse in the 10 years since then. And so this struggle between being free and making our own decisions and solving our own problems versus being centrally controlled and having an all-knowing, all-powerful government make those decisions for us, that is the battle that will decide whether or not technology is going to keep making our lives better in the way that washing machines and energy, etc., has over the last 250 years, or whether technology is going to become our prison, which is what the likes of the World Economic Forum and others would like to see, where they want the government to be in control of the technology so that it doesn't make your life and my life better, but so that they can actually create a digital prison where we are monitored, we are watched. With digital currencies, they can control what we spend our money on. And in fact, they can control whether we get to spend our money. To be clear, that's central bank digital currencies. Digital currencies like Bitcoin, of course, are decentralized and no one can stop you from spending it. But the whole idea of a central bank digital currency, which are being trialed around the world, is that they'll be able to program your money and they'll be able to decide what you're allowed to spend it on. And so we have technology advancing at a terrific rate, and it has the potential to make our lives unimaginably better. In another 100 years, they will look back 100 years and say, how could anybody have lived like that? How could anybody have lived in 2025 without all of these other technologies that you and I can't imagine right now, but which people will invent over the next 100 years? But whether or not that's the future, or whether we live in a dystopia where that technology is used against us, comes down to this fight between central control and those who want to have power versus those who insist on being free.
You mentioned obviously about surveillance, and I'm reminded of you hear so much about Palantir, but I was just listening to someone the other day. He was mentioning about how this has been going on for a while, so it's not really news. It's only just more entered the zeitgeist of everybody, so to speak, about surveillance and these private and corporate entities merging. Could you perhaps unpack more of your thoughts on that, where you see things going, perhaps other trends as it relates to this, so on and so forth?
Yeah. So technology is agnostic. Technology itself is neither evil nor good. It's about how it gets applied and how it gets used. Now, I was a part of the protest movement here in Melbourne, Australia, against the COVID lockdowns. So Melbourne, my home city of Melbourne, Australia, in the state of Victoria, in the south of Australia, became the most locked down city in the world outside of China. And even for a while, actually more locked down than any part of China had been. We had a government that locked us in our homes for 23 hours a day. We were only allowed to leave for 1 hour per day. And even then, it was only for one of 4 approved activities, which was approved work, essential medical care, essential shopping. We could only go shopping for 1 hour, and approved work and exercise. We could go and do exercise for 1 hour, but we had to exercise by ourselves. We couldn't gather at parks, or playgrounds got closed down. They put concrete bollards and they put gravel down into things like skate parks and things so that people couldn't use them. They put tape around playgrounds, children's playgrounds, so that no one could use the playgrounds. I, of course, used them anyway. I took my kids to the park every single day and we played on the playgrounds as just a public symbol of defiance. And yeah, I copped some crap from people for doing that, but that's by the by. I was a core part of the protest movement, and we showed up and we stood on our human right to peacefully protest. When I say protest in Australia, I think it probably translates in America probably more to a rally, as opposed to, we're not talking Black Lives Matter, burn the city down, mostly peaceful kind of stuff. We're talking about people, families, gathering with placards and with chants and wanting to be heard. That's what we're talking about. And the government came down with brutal force, rubber bullets and pepper spray being used on people who, let me say again, were not doing any damage or harm to anyone or anything. We weren't smashing windows. We weren't being violent. We weren't causing trouble. But the police would move in on us and would initiate violence and would initiate trouble. I actually documented it all. I've got a documentary. Anyone can go online and watch this for free. You don't have to buy it. If you go to battlegroundmelbourne.com, this is my documentary that I made about that story. And it follows the fall of the world's most livable city. Melbourne was the world's most livable city, according to the people who measure such things. For 7 years in a row, we won the world's most livable city award. And then we became the world's most locked down city. And I tell that story in Battleground Melbourne. So I'm a big believer in freedom, and I've put my money where my mouth is. The rubber hit the road. I ended up on criminal charges here in Australia. The government charged me with criminal offences because I was writing posts on Facebook encouraging people to join the peaceful protests. And for encouraging people to participate in peaceful protests during the lockdowns, they pursued me for 2.5 years with criminal charges, a thing called incitement, because I was encouraging other people to break the law. Now, they dropped those charges in the end because they were hopeless charges and they were never going to make them stick, but they used that as a weapon. The process is the punishment. They hold that against you and they try and punish you. So we know that governments want total power. And we know that governments will use technology to try and enforce their power. And like I said at the beginning of this, technology is agnostic. So they, for example, would use surveillance cameras to try and watch who was there and identify them using social media to then go to their homes. And I had police coming to my house because they had me on camera and threatening to arrest me and do various things to me or to my family because I was participating in those protests. And that happened to thousands of people in Victoria. And they were using social media and technology to enable their tyranny. But that same technology, emails, instant messaging, video live streaming, and so forth, were also the tools that we were using to be effective in our protest movement and to grow that movement. And so the technology itself was agnostic. The technology itself cuts both ways. It's about how it gets used. And this is why I'm all about the fight between people who insist on being free versus the people who want to centralize power and to have power over others. Technology can't be stopped. Technology is going to flourish. Robotics, AI, Android, fake humans, all that sort of stuff. Sorry, it's coming. And you're not going to stop it any more than anyone was able to stop the steam power revolution or the microprocessor revolution. That is going to happen. But the technology itself is not the thing that you need to be afraid of. What you need to be concerned about are the people that want to use that technology to seize and increase their power. But recognize that that very same technology is the thing that is going to give you the ability to get around those people. We were using instant messaging and private messaging and encrypted apps. We were using live streams of our events. We would even tap into, so they would have the news helicopters flying above our protests. And we would actually be live streaming that on our phones while we were out there and using that as tactical information, because they weren't just showing the protests. We could also see where the police were, thanks to the news helicopter flying above. And so we had aerial reconnaissance courtesy of technology on our side that we were able to use at a tactical level in those protests to try and avoid the police, because we were the ones who were not bringing the trouble. We were the ones trying to peacefully protest. They were the ones bringing the violence. So the technology is agnostic. It comes down to how it gets used. And so for me, the fight is about controlling the humans that want to control the rest of us.
We hear so much about the WEF, Davos, things of that nature. Do you see things coming to a kind of a climax, if you will, in the coming years? I hear so much of this from fellow guests that I bring on, especially geopolitically, and that there be some type of a reset, whether that's financial, social. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
I think there have always been people that want to rule the world. The Napoleon Bonapartes of this world are much more common than we might like to think. And they don't all get to be great military leaders. Many of them just end up working in an office somewhere or getting a government job or being a police officer or running for politics. They say that about 1 in every 100 males that is born is a psychopath. And because of the traits of a psychopath and what they find appealing, they get unreasonably attracted to positions of high power and high influence and high money. So you are disproportionately likely to find psychopaths and sociopaths in places like the top end of the corporate world, the top end of the political world, and the top end of the bureaucracies. They love power, and they're very good at playing power games and working their way up those sorts of trees. And so, unfortunately, it's an unfortunate fact that if the government, I don't know how many government employees there are in the US, but there's over 1 million of them here in Australia, which if 1 in every 25 of them is a psychopath or a sociopath, well, that's a lot of people with power that are building their little petty kingdoms in the name of the government and using that power against us. Places like Davos, the World Economic Forum, I would suggest are magnetic to those sorts of personalities. That 1 in 25 ratio probably doesn't apply in a place like that. It's probably 1 in 10. It might be more. The desire to get into a position like that for someone who has psychopathic tendencies they'd be willing to sacrifice just about anything to be able to get their hands on that kind of influence and that kind of power and that kind of prestige. So it doesn't surprise me that these sorts of groups kind of form, and that people with those personality traits and types really get around these groups and get behind them and support them. That's not a surprise at all. What concerns me is then how that gets taken and disseminated throughout the world. That's more of the concern. And where the World Economic Forum have been very clever is with their Young Leaders program. And so the likes of former New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, the current French President Emmanuel Macron, the former Canadian President Justin Castro, I think his name was Castro. It was Castro, wasn't it? Yeah, it was definitely Castro. Justin Trudeau, of course, but I would suggest perhaps a Castro genetically. These people were all graduates of the World Economic Forum's Young Leaders program. And this is where the World Economic Forum essentially were doing their evangelism. This was very, very clever on their part. This is where they would bring in young up-and-comers, people who were either very talented or other people might argue had been selected, had been groomed in a sense to move into these sorts of positions. And they ideologically indoctrinated them and then sent them back out again. And this is where Klaus Schwab used the phrase, we have infiltrated or we have permeated their cabinets. He's talking about the fact that the Young Leaders program and these ideological acolytes are now taking the ideas that they learned at Davos and taking those directly into parliaments and congresses, etc., around the world. But again, that doesn't really change the problem that we face. The problem that we face is the struggle between those who would be free and those who want power over others. And as an Australian, I can't stop Davos from being Davos, but I can address Australian politicians who want to bring in bad policies. And so if Davos wants to infiltrate our cabinet and infiltrate our parliament, I can't stop them from achieving that, but I can call it out. And I can call out the policies that then emerge out of that and make sure that those are given the proper daylight, the proper scrutiny that they deserve. So each of us really, my response to things like Davos and that centralized kind of control is not so much to try and attack them directly. I talk about them all the time, but it's not so much to attack them directly because I can't hit them from where I am. It's, in my case, if I fight their acolytes here in Australia, and we can win politically and stop the bad policies from getting brought in. And then if you're able to do the same where you are and someone else is able to do the same in Europe and New Zealand and Africa and et cetera, then that's the level at which we need to be fighting our battles. Because there's no point. It'd be a little bit like the troops that are storming the beaches of Normandy, all pointing their guns at Berlin and pulling the trigger and firing bullets in the direction of Berlin. Well, Berlin might be your ultimate destination. Berlin might be where the war is ultimately going to be won. But right now you have to fight the battle for the beach. And so I need to fight the battles that are present in my country and in my life and in my particular circumstances. And you need to fight the battles in yours. And I think we are turning the tide. I think that a lot of these globalists, these psychopaths, overplayed their hand during COVID, and a lot more people have become aware of what they're up to. But the focus for me now is to stop people from fixating on the World Economic Forum and Davos, and to get people to turn their focus and their attention to the local battles that need to be fought and to begin winning those, because that's how we turn the tide.
You mentioned about psychopaths and things of that nature, and I feel like most people in the general public, Topher, kind of see more or less government as kind of benevolent, and I think it's not until you get kind of red pilled, so to speak, or awaken, if you will, like an alternative media, when you get exposed to different things and what's kind of really going on. Not that I or anyone perhaps knows everything per se, of course, but I feel like once you get kind of exposed to that, it just changes your whole perception of things. And you pointed out, I think you said one in 25 or something like that, being you know like a psychopath, if you will. Yeah, I'm not surprised. Question, and I'd like to, of course, segue into how people are taking action over where you are, perhaps on the kind of the grassroots, if you will. How would you define the existing power structure as far as the makeup of things go?
So I define, and I talk about this a lot in my. I promise you, I'm not here to just plug all my stuff, but
Please.
I have a second book called "Good Christians Break Bad Laws," where I go into the theology of civil disobedience and the fact that I believe as a Christian, it is actually our obligation to disobey governments when they overstep their God-given boundaries. And I think it's a terrible tragedy that so many churches are preaching blind obedience to government. I define the state of the world as it is right now as one of idolatry. We culturally in the West worship government. More specifically, we worship power, and I would actually go deeper and say government worships death. I think this is actually an extension of the ancient Canaanite religions and Moloch and the worship of death. But that's probably a bridge too far for this particular podcast. But we worship power, and we have placed government into the position that God is supposed to hold in our lives. And I think this is on purpose, and I think that it's actually quite explicit. If you go into the Old Testament, you'll see that God gives himself a number of different names. Jehovah something, Jehovah Jireh, Jehovah Nissi, Jehovah Tzidkenu. There's a number of different names, and each of them has a different meaning, which speaks to something that God promises to us. So Jehovah Jireh is my provider. God will provide. And there's Jehovah, the giver of wisdom, Jehovah, the bringer of security and the liberator, so to speak. And there's a bunch of promises that are built into the names of God. And if you actually go through them, and I do in this book, if you actually go through them, each and every one of these things has been supplanted by government. Government says, we will educate you and give you wisdom. We will collect statistics and provide you with information. We will make decisions. We will be your high priest. to guide you in what you ought to do with your life and what we ought to do as a country. We will be your provider. If you ever fall on hard times, the government, instead of Jehovah Jireh, it's now government Jireh. The government will be your provider. And we saw, unfortunately, during COVID, that churches treated the government's word as though it was more important and carried more weight than God's word. Now, there were exceptions, Pastor Artur Pawlowski up in Canada being a high-profile one, as well as there was a California pastor who just recently passed away, whose name escapes me, and he was quite high profile in California, and we had a few here in Australia as well. But they were the exceptions. The vast majority of churches actually said, okay, government, whatever you tell me you want me to do. You want me to shut my doors? Okay, I'll shut my doors. And keep in mind, here in Australia, churches were shut for months on end. This wasn't a 2 weeks to flatten the curve thing. That's what they said at the start. And then they kept the churches shut down for months on end and segregated us, so that even when they allowed churches to resume, they said, well, you can't let unvaccinated people in. Or they then changed the rules and said, well, you can let vaccinated people in, but the number of people you're allowed to have is much lower if you allow if you allow unvaccinated people to be in that congregation. Medical apartheid in the name of government, in direct violation of God's instruction for the body of Christ to not forsake the gathering together of the saints. And unfortunately, a lot of pastors actually said, okay, government, you can have the place of God. We will obey your word. We will do as you tell us to do. And so I think where we're actually at is a position of idolatry, not just the church, but actually as a culture, we have turned government into our God, and we allow the government to perform a lot of the functions of God. And the number one thing, I mean, as much as I'm involved politically and I'm in commentary at a political level, actually the number one thing that is needed right now is for us to theologically, religiously, even for people who don't believe in God, we need to reject the idea that the government is God, because at the moment that's where we're at.
I agree with you. Particularly whether or not people are religious or not, I think religion, serves a purpose and has served a purpose for a couple millennia. And I guess what I'm getting at is you can see as evident, kind of like in the conversation that we had earlier, Topher, um, with kind of the breakdown in society, like in the West and such, and kind of the you mentioned like the sexual revolution and many other things that occurred during the 60s. Um, whole nother topic. I've been seeing also a lot of podcasters talk about. I'm not, and I love my boomers, but it is interesting. Certain segments in a certain cohort, kind of really setting the stage, if you will, more or less, and how it's created ripple effects, so to speak, today, as evident in so many people not being challenged, economically, and you look at what's going on socially. And you mentioned kind of the Moloch stuff just for a moment, and I know some people might go over their head, if you will, listening, but I actually was watching. I was very intrigued by this. I don't know if you're familiar with Dave Collum, but he kind of exposed me to these. You have to check him out. He's really awesome, Dave Collum, and he went down that rabbit hole that I know, like SRA kind of stuff. And there was an Australian lady who her last name I think is Barrett, and I know she's got to be pretty famous over there in that world, but she was on YouTube talking about it, and it just blew my mind. So I know that's a different rabbit hole, but that's a fascinating topic that very few are aware of.
Yeah, and there's a really good book on that for anyone that does want to dive deeper down it. It's called Return of the Gods. It is by Jonathan Cahn, Cahn, Return of the Gods. Now, Jonathan Cahn is a prolific author. I haven't actually read any of his other books except for this one. And 2/3 of the book was stuff that I already had thought about and I already knew. And I went, yeah, okay, ho-hum. That's for me. I'm someone who lives and breathes in this space, so it might be a bit more engaging for others. But then I got to the final third of the book, and there was some things in there that were absolutely terrific and that I wasn't aware of and I'd never come across before, and really cemented my view that actually the struggles that we're facing today really are just a redux, a repeat of the struggles that humanity has faced since the beginning. And we really are fighting the old battles. We are fighting the return of the old gods, the return of the gods, as Jonathan Cahn calls it in his book. So I commend that book to anyone that does want to dive a little bit deeper. But on the challenges and the cohorts and the generations that we see today, if I can touch on that for a moment, one of the things that concerns me is I see a lot of people correctly identifying the problem and then prescribing the wrong solution. And so the problem right now is that for a lot of people, life is a lot harder than it was only a few years ago. In Australia, we actually have the metrics on this. We have the data on this. In just the last 3 years, our quality of life has dropped back to lower than what it was before 2012. So we've lost about 13 years of economic growth and wealth expansion in just the last 3 years. And that's happened because of terrible economic policy over here in Australia, increases in taxes, lots of things making the cost of living a lot higher, the government creating lots of new jobs that aren't productive. So we're spending money on people that are really just kind of wasting their time. And our whole living situation is getting a lot worse. And I know that a lot of Americans feel similarly, and around the world, a lot of people feel similarly. But what's happening is people are correctly identifying that things are harder than they should be. And then they go looking for a scapegoat. And some people, for example, will look at the boomers and say, well, the boomers have all the wealth and all the property and everything else, so it must be their fault that I'm poor. Other people are looking at immigrants and saying, well, immigrants are taking our jobs, so it must be their fault that I'm poor. And yeah, each of those things, all the different things that they're pointing to can have a kernel of truth in them. But fundamentally, the thing that's making us poor is government. And I want to really drive this point home, because this cuts to the heart of what I'm all about, which is the struggle between those who would be free and those who would have control over others. There is a single number that I believe encapsulates the problem from an economic point of view, from a quality of life point of view, from the point of view of your lived experience. There is a single number that we can measure. And if this number gets better, your life gets better. If this number gets worse, your life gets worse. It takes a moment to explain, though. It is the difference between the purchasing power that you get from your salary or from your clients if you're running your own business or what have you, the purchasing power that you're left with after all the taxes and everything is taken out, versus the purchasing power that you cost your employer or your clients or what have you. Let me illustrate using Australian numbers, but I don't think the American numbers are going to be much better. In Australia, the median Australian full-time salary is up around 80,000 Australian dollars, something like 60,000 US dollars, something like that. Now, for an employer to pay somebody $80,000, their out-of-pocket costs are going to be north of $100,000, because in addition to the salary, they then have to pay for things like work cover insurance, which is like an injury insurance scheme, which is mandatory. It's a government-run insurance scheme. They also have to pay payroll taxes, which are state-level taxes, 3, 4, 5% added on top. They also have to pay for a thing called superannuation, which is like a mandatory 401k. That's a mandatory savings towards your retirement. And the money's locked away. It has to go into the share market or into real estate or these sorts of things. It's not useful to the person who's receiving that money until they turn 65. So that's money gone out of the economy. The employer has to pay it, but the employee doesn't receive that purchasing power. And when you add all these things on, more than $100,000 comes out of the business's pocket in order to pay this person 80,000 Australian dollars. But of course, the person doesn't get 80,000 Australian dollars in purchasing power. They then have to pay income tax, which is going to take about sort of 15, 17 grand. Then they have to pay GST, goods and services tax. I think it's called VAT in most states in the USA, consumption tax. Then there's a bunch of other fees and charges and taxes that apply to just life in general. You have to buy government licenses to do all sorts of different things, pay for mandatory government insurances around other things. Every time you move house, you pay tens of thousands of dollars in stamp duty to the state government for the privilege of transferring the ownership of the title from that person to you. And when you add it all together, the median Australian full-time salary earner whose official salary is $80,000 is taking home, is actually getting the benefit of, in terms of purchasing power, the benefit of about 45,000 Australian dollars. But remember, they're costing their employer more than 100,000 Australian dollars. And here's why that matters. Because all of the prices of everything that you need to buy with that $45,000 worth of purchasing power, all of those prices have to be set to recover the cost of over 100,000 Australian dollars. And so you're left there with $45,000 chasing goods and services that are priced to recoup vastly more money than what you're actually being left with in purchasing power. And we can't get out of this problem with pay rises. We can't get out of this problem with governments incentivizing or subsidizing or doing any of this kind of nonsense. The only way we get out of this problem is by reducing that gap, the distance between the amount of purchasing power you actually get to use in your life versus the amount of purchasing power that the company has to recoup for having paid you your salary. We get rid of that gap, or we start to reduce that gap, your life and everyone else's life, rich and poor alike, everyone's life gets better. You make that gap bigger and worse, and everyone's life gets worse. And the reason why life feels hard right now for Australians, and I'm sure for a lot of other people around the world, is because that gap has gotten bigger dramatically in just the last few years. So my concern is that people are correctly identifying the problem, and then they're prescribing the wrong solution. They're blaming immigrants, they're blaming old people, they're blaming capitalists, and they're blaming Elon Musk and billionaires, and they're not actually sitting there and going, hang on, the government did this to us, and the government can undo this to us, and we can fix this problem without having to make enemies out of each other.
Well said. Well said. Yeah, it is. Obviously, you're bringing up the financial nature of things. Most people are, just in the West in general, are not aware of the monetary system that we have in place. With the money printing, fiat, and all that stuff. Yeah, it's striking. I was listening to Professor, I think it's Professor Werner. He's been on several shows. He's been on, I think, on Tucker's as well. He kind of unpacked kind of the insidious nature of the wonderful private central banks. Um, Wanted to see what other things that are catching your attention, or perhaps things that are most alarming to you presently.
Well, here in Australia, we've got some very specific fights that are quite concerning, particularly coming from our own government. Of course, that's the ultimate enemy of freedom is government, because government wants power, and that's what the contest is, those who would be free versus those who would have power. We've got a thing where the government now, they've tried to ram through a number of essentially censorship bills. In 2021, I think it was, or it might have been before then, they created a thing called the E-Safety Office. Now, this was a new government department with a thing called the E-Safety Commissioner, the Online or Electronic Safety Commissioner. And they appointed a woman by the name of Julie Inman Grant. It's not a name that I'd expect you or your listeners to know, but you can look her up. She's an interesting woman. She's an American-Australian and a disgruntled former Twitter employee. And boy, does she have an axe to grind against Elon Musk specifically, but also just against tech companies and social media companies as a category. And so she was brought in, and the government immediately tried to bring in a thing called the Misinformation Disinformation Bill. Now, this came out of COVID. This was because during COVID, people like myself who said that lockdowns were doing more harm than good, I was called a denier of science. I was called a granny killer. I was called all sorts of different things. It turns out now the evidence all stacks up and I was completely right. And I knew that all along, and they were the ones who were denying the actual science. But nevertheless, I got given the label of a misinformation spreader. And this idea of misinformation and disinformation was really pushed hard by the mainstream media for quite a long time in an effort to get people like me shut down. And so what happened was the government picked up that idea and said, well, we need to ban misinformation and disinformation. And they put forward a bill, an act of parliament to try and make that happen. But of course, you immediately run into the age-old question of, well, who defines what is misinformation and disinformation? And how do we know that they're actually correct? And even if you could define it, are you really better off getting rid of it? Or are you better off letting people say the nonsense, say the stupid thing, so that other people can reply and let free speech sort it out, which is, of course, the American First Amendment approach, which I wholeheartedly endorse, and that's what we should do here in Australia. So they had this bill. And it was nothing more than 1984 style censorship. This was going to allow the government to be our single source of truth, to be the people who decided what was true and what was not, and could shove it down our throats and tell us what we were allowed to say and what we were not allowed to say. Now, thankfully, we managed to raise enough of a fuss and turn enough politicians against this policy that the policy went down. It wasn't enacted into law. But now the government are getting creative, and they're trying to find new ways of getting that same power for themselves. They're also at the same time trying to create a thing called a digital ID, or they've actually successfully created a thing called a digital ID. And the way they managed to get that enacted through Parliament was by promising that it wouldn't be mandatory. But they said the same thing about the COVID vaccines, by the way, and then you couldn't get a job without them. So, but what they're doing is they're trying to make it really difficult for you to live and survive without a digital ID. And once you get a digital ID, it's tied to all of your online activities. So there's no such thing as online anonymity for you anymore. Everything that you do in Australia is going to be tracked by the Australian government through your digital ID. Now, for someone like myself, that doesn't personally impact me because everything that I do is under my own name. I don't do anything anonymously. Everything I do is already public and my face is already attached to it. But I 100% defend the right of people who feel the need to be anonymous for whatever reason to be anonymous. So this is an attack by the Australian government against fundamental freedoms to be able to speak, to be able to listen, and to be able to do it anonymously and not have every single move we make being tracked by the government. So the government got the digital ID enacted, but they haven't had a massive amount of uptake. There's a lot of Australians saying, no thanks, we don't want it, we don't need it. Now, they can't make it mandatory because they said they wouldn't do that. But what they're doing is they're trying to make it really difficult for anyone to live without one. So the latest attempt at that is a thing called the under 16s social media ban. And this has come from the eSafety office, this Julie Inman Grant lady that I mentioned to you earlier, the American ex-Twitter employee who's got a chip on her shoulder. Now, what this does is it's wrapped in the packaging of protecting children. They're pretending that this is about making sure that children are safe online. And so what they're saying is that anyone under 16 years of age is not allowed to have a social media account of their own. They can't be on Facebook, they can't be on YouTube, they can't be on Instagram or TikTok or any of these platforms. Now, in order to do that, of course, how do you find out who's under 16 and who's not? Well, you have to verify everybody's age. Even the people who are over 16 now have to submit to online verification. How do you do that? Well, you do that through a digital ID, of course. And so this comes in December of this year, and this has the potential to have a terrible impact on what I do as an independent political commentator in Australia, is that you will have to verify your age to use any Google product, including, by the way, your Gmail, Google search. It applies to search engines. So just going to Google or going to Bing, it will apply. It applies to every social media account. And so they're trying to make it impossible for Australians to exist digitally, to have any kind of digital presence without submitting first to a government-issued digital ID and making sure that they can monitor and track and observe absolutely everything that we do. And so that's the big fight that is on in Australia right now. I'm a part of that fight, pushing back against that. And there are other many amazing Australians who are pushing back against that, including some of our politicians. Not all of our politicians are bought and paid for, so to speak. There are some really good ones who are fighting hard and pushing back. But unfortunately, it has been a bit of a losing battle in Australia for the last probably 30 years, but particularly the last 5 or so years. A lot of Australians really are sucked in. They are, and they actually believe that the government is looking after them and has their best interests at heart. And the government would never do anything wrong to us. That we can trust our government. This kind of naivety is unfortunately very prevalent in Australia. So it is a bit of an uphill battle. The greatest source for hope for me at the moment, obviously I'm going to keep fighting regardless, but the greatest source of hope for me at the moment is actually President Donald Trump. President Trump is changing the world. He's not just changing America, he's changing the world. And I've released a couple of videos in just the last couple of weeks about some of the really significant things that are coming out of the US. I don't know if you're aware, the US Energy Department came out with a report stating that CO2 is not a pollutant. Which is a seismic shift from where things have been. The EPA have come out and said that they're looking at rescinding the endangerment finding, which would eliminate instantly a lot of the limits on CO2 emissions from power plants or from cars, or it would get rid of all of the subsidies for electric vehicles, etc. Instantly. All the legal justification for that would be gone. We've also seen Donald Trump putting a lot of pressure on the UK and some pressure on Australia regarding our restrictions of freedom of speech. I don't know if you saw, but when the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer met with President Trump and Vice President JD Vance in the White House to talk about tariffs and trade negotiations, JD Vance made it very clear that free speech in the UK and the curtailing of free speech in the UK was a serious concern from the point of view of the Trump administration. And Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, tried to say, or he said, we have a long history of free speech in the United Kingdom and we're very proud of that and it's going to continue for a very long time. And JD Vance kind of went, yeah, buddy, sit down. We're going to talk about this later. So there is a great deal of hope for me, and the fight is very much on. And I would actually love to see President Trump really savage Australia and the UK and other countries that are destroying free speech for their own citizens. I would love to see President Trump slap Australia with very, very large tariffs, 50%, 75%, 100% tariffs on Australian goods and services, not because I want the economic damage that would be done by that, and it would be harmful economically, but because we, the people of Australia who are fighting for Australia, we don't have a lot of leverage right now. And something like that, having the president of the United States come out and say, sorry, the AUKUS mutual defense deal on the submarines, that's off until you give your citizens free speech again. Something like that coming out of the US would be tremendously helpful to us. However, I have no control over what President Trump does, but I will continue to fight for freedom in Australia, and I'll continue to fight for freedom of speech, especially. It is foundational. And unfortunately, yeah, that's the big battle that we've got in Australia right now.
It sounds so much like, I was talking to a couple people that I know, Ivor Cummins and John Waters over in Ireland, and a lot of the stuff that's going on. Of course, over here in California, we've had our own issues. I mean, all over, it's crazy, especially the people getting arrested for vocalizing themselves and such. Topher, how can people get in touch with you and learn more about you?
Well, thank you. So I'm at Topher Field, so it's spelt like that, at Topher Field on all the socials. I guess you can't quite see that, can you? Topher Field on all the socials. You'll find me on YouTube. That's where I'm most prolific. I release multiple videos every day, sometimes about global issues, sometimes about Australian issues, as well as I'm active on all of the social media platforms, X especially, but also Facebook. I'm very active there, and a little bit on Instagram, and I'm starting to use TikTok and a few of these other ones as well. But also you can find me at goodpeoplebreakbadlaws.com. That is the name of my book. And that is, so goodpeoplebreakbadlaws.com is where you'll find this. This is about civil disobedience in the modern age. It draws from history as well as from my own experiences during the COVID lockdowns to talk about civil disobedience in the modern age. For the Christians among us, there is Good Christians Break Bad Laws. This is about the theology of civil disobedience and the fact that the church needs to stop treating the government as though it's God. Then there's also this has won, I think it's 14 awards around the world now, multi-award winning feature-length documentary about what happened in Melbourne, about what went down. And I had the privilege of directing this. You can buy the DVD at goodpeoplebreakbadlaws.com, but actually you can watch it for free. Just go to battlegroundmelbourne.com. You can watch it there completely for free. And I've got other merch and stuff. If people want to help me to keep doing what I'm doing and keep fighting for freedom in Australia, I appreciate people doing that. But yeah, it's at Topher Field on all the socials and goodpeoplebreakbadlaws.com as a website.
Appreciate you breaking these things down, and especially as it relates to what's going on in Australia. Hope to have you on in the near future, and appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me, Christian. Go well, and I hope the podcast flourishes.
I appreciate it.
Quick ask, over half of you who watch the show regularly haven't yet subscribed. If you've enjoyed the show, you're finding value in it, subscribing is really the best way to support the channel. It's, of course, free. It literally takes 2 seconds, and it lets the algorithm know that this content matters. And of course, my commitment to you is going to be that I'm going to continue to bring on great guests, refine those questions. And of course, I'm always receptive to your feedback. If there's certain people that you'd like to have on, or certain questions, or this, that, and the other that you'd like to have as part of the show going forward, things of that nature, please let me know. I'm pretty easy to access. Anyhow, that's my commitment to you. If you can subscribe, that would mean a lot. Thanks.